On a hillside in Connecticut, where the Farmington River curves through what was once the most prestigious estate country in New England, there once stood a palace made entirely of glass. It rose 70 feet wide and 3 stories high. Its arched roof could swallow a full-grown palm. Inside, through winter months when snow piled 6 feet deep against the walls outside, the temperature never dropped below 75 degrees. Orchids bloomed. Banana trees bore fruit. The air hung thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth, of jasmine, of 1,000 species pulled from jungles half a world away. This was the Hartford Conservatory. And for 38 years, it consumed more money each winter than it cost to heat 10 ordinary mansions. Between 1880 and 1950, over 200 glass conservatories rose across the United States. They crowned the estates of railroad barons and steel magnates. They stretched across acres of carefully manicured grounds. They required armies of servants to maintain. And by 1960, nearly all of them had vanished, leaving barely a trace. This is the story of why America's richest families spent fortunes to keep banana trees alive in February. And why every one of those fortunes failed. To understand what happened, we must go back to the moment when one man's obsession and revolutionary technology collided. When glass could command winter itself. And when no one yet understood the price that perfection would demand. This is the story of the glass palaces. And the hidden cost that destroyed them all. William Hartford was born in the spring of 1860, in a brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City. His father, Cornelius Hartford, had built a railroad empire connecting Chicago to the eastern seaboard. His mother died when William was 6. His 2 older brothers, Cornelius Jr. and Robert, were athletic, robust, natural heirs to a business that required strength and stamina. William was not. He suffered from asthma. The coal smoke that powered his father's fortune filled his lungs with fire. Winters in New York left him gasping, confined to bed while his brothers learned the railroad business at their father's side. Doctors prescribed fresh air, rest, and the vague hope that he might outgrow his weakness. He never did. What William lacked in physical strength, he compensated for with an appetite for knowledge. While his brothers inspected rail yards and negotiated with union leaders, William spent his days in the family library. He read botany texts from England. He studied the great conservatories of Europe through illustrated magazines. He sketched impossible gardens in the margins of his notebooks. His father regarded this with quiet disappointment. His brothers with open contempt. When Cornelius Hartford died in 1883, he left his railroad empire to his 2 eldest sons. To William, age 23, he left $10 million and a single piece of advice recorded in the will. Make something of yourself that does not require you to compete with your brothers. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1885, William Hartford boarded a steamship bound for Liverpool. He traveled alone. His brothers were too busy with railroads. His doctors encouraged the journey, hoping European air might ease his lungs. William hoped for something else entirely. He spent 6 months crossing England, France, and Germany. He visited botanical gardens and great estates. He dined with dukes and minor nobility who found his wealth charming and his fascination with plants eccentric but harmless. And then, on a cold morning in November of 1885, William Hartford stood in the Palm House at Kew Gardens in London. The structure rose before him like a cathedral built of light. 400 feet long. Arched glass ribs curved overhead, sheltering a jungle of tropical species. The air hit him first. Warm. Humid. Heavy with the scent of living things. Palm trees soared toward the glass ceiling. Ferns spilled across pathways. Water dripped from broad leaves onto tiled floors. Outside, winter. Inside, paradise. William walked the length of the Palm House 3 times that first day. He returned the next morning. And the morning after that. He filled his notebook with measurements, sketches, the names of species he had never seen. On his fourth visit, he wrote a single sentence in his diary. "I will build this in America. Greater than anything Europe has ever seen." But it was Chatsworth, the estate of the Duke of Devonshire, that sealed William's obsession. The conservatory there stretched across nearly an acre. Its glass walls rose to impossible heights. Inside, the Duke cultivated species from every corner of the British Empire. A Titan arum from Sumatra. Orchids from Ceylon. Palms from the Congo. William was granted a private tour. The Duke's head gardener explained the heating systems. The coal boilers that ran day and night. The network of pipes beneath the floors. The constant vigilance required to maintain tropical temperatures through English winters. William listened. He calculated. And that night, in his room at the estate, he wrote a letter to his brothers. "I have found my purpose. What you build with steel and steam, I will build with glass and living things. You have your empire. I will have mine." He posted the letter the next morning. He never received a reply. William returned to New York in the spring of 1886. He was 26 years old. He had spent 6 months abroad. And he returned with a vision that bordered on madness. He would build the greatest conservatory America had ever seen. But first, he needed to understand what had made such a thing possible. Glass, for most of human history, came in small pieces. Crown glass, the dominant method before the mid-1800s, involved blowing molten glass into a sphere, then spinning it flat. The result was round, wavy sheets rarely wider than a foot. Expensive. Fragile. Impractical for anything larger than a window. Then came plate glass. Factories in Britain, and soon after in Pittsburgh, discovered they could pour molten glass directly onto flat iron tables. Rollers pressed it smooth. Polishing removed imperfections. The result was sheets of glass several feet across, clear and strong enough to form walls. Suddenly, glass could do what it had never done before. It could enclose space. It could bring light flooding into buildings. It could create the illusion that walls did not exist at all. But glass alone was not enough. Wood, the traditional material for framing greenhouses, warped under constant humidity. It rotted. It could not span the distances required for truly grand conservatories. Foundries answered with cast iron. Iron could be molded in factories into any shape architects dreamed. It could be shipped in pieces and bolted together on site. Most importantly, iron ribs could span 50 feet or more without sagging under the weight of glass and snow. They could arch high enough to shelter full-grown palms. At Kew Gardens, at the Crystal Palace in London, at conservatories across Europe, cast iron skeletons held up glass vaults that seemed to defy gravity itself. American engineers studied these blueprints. They measured. They calculated. And they understood that what Europe had built, America could build larger. The final piece was heat. Keeping a glass palace warm in January required industrial power. Coal-fired steam boilers, some as large as locomotive engines, sat in basements or outbuildings. Steam pipes ran beneath walkways and benches, radiating warmth into every corner. With careful engineering, temperatures inside could hover at 75 degrees even as snow piled against the glass outside. The same technology that powered factories and railroad engines could now keep banana trees alive in Connecticut. By the 1870s, these three innovations had converged. Plate glass. Cast iron frames. Steam heat. For the first time in history, it was possible to build a cathedral of glass and keep it as warm as the tropics. Technology had made the impossible merely expensive. And for men with William Hartford's fortune, expense was not an obstacle. Or so he believed. In the autumn of 1888, William Hartford purchased 125,000 acres in the hills of northwestern Connecticut. The land ran along the Farmington River. It was remote. Beautiful. And far enough from New York that his brothers would not have to see what he was building. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect in America. Hunt had designed mansions for the Vanderbilts. He understood both grandeur and the structural demands of glass. The plans took 18 months to complete. The main mansion would contain 250 rooms. Gothic Revival style. Stone and timber. Traditional and dignified. But the conservatory. The conservatory would be something else entirely. 70 feet wide. 150 feet long. 3 stories high at its central dome. The arched glass roof would rest on cast iron ribs shipped from foundries in Pennsylvania. The heating system would require its own dedicated boiler house, connected to the conservatory by underground tunnels. Inside, 3 climate zones. Tropical. Temperate. Desert. Each maintained at precise temperatures. Each capable of supporting species from their native habitats. The estimated cost for the conservatory alone was $500,000. In 1890, that sum could have built 50 comfortable homes. It was the equivalent of $15 million today. Richard Hunt presented the plans in William's New York study on a cold afternoon in February of 1890. William reviewed each page in silence. Hunt pointed out the boiler capacity, the coal storage, the projected heating costs. $50,000 per year. Every year. Forever. William's brothers, Cornelius Jr. and Robert, attended the meeting. They had insisted. As co-executors of their father's estate, they had a legal right to review any expenditure over $100,000. Cornelius spoke first. "You're spending $500,000 on a greenhouse." William did not look up from the blueprints. "A conservatory. Not a greenhouse." Robert leaned forward. $50,000 a year to keep it warm. That's the operating budget for the entire family estate in Newport. For one building. I understand the costs. Then you understand this is madness. William closed the portfolio of blueprints. He looked at his brothers for the first time. "This is my inheritance. My fortune. And I will spend it as I see fit." Cornelius stood. "You'll bankrupt yourself within a decade." William smiled. "Then I'll have a magnificent decade." He turned to Richard Hunt. "We proceed. Spare no expense." Construction began in the spring of 1890. 100 masons worked year after year. The rose granite came from local quarries, cut to specifications so precise that each block fit together like pieces of a puzzle. The glass, sheet by sheet, arrived on railroad cars from Pittsburgh, each pane wrapped in straw, each one numbered to match the architect's plans. The cast iron frames were forged in Pennsylvania foundries, where men worked in heat that rivaled the tropics Hartford hoped to create. Each rib was numbered, catalogued, shipped north to Connecticut in pieces weighing hundreds of pounds each. William visited the site every day. Rain or snow, he would drive his carriage up the hill to watch progress. He walked the construction grounds with Hunt's assistant architects. He reviewed every detail. The thickness of the glass. The spacing of the iron ribs. The depth of the foundations that would have to support all that weight. His brothers watched from a distance. They had invested nothing in the project. They would inherit nothing from its completion. And they believed, with absolute certainty, that William was destroying himself. The conservatory rose slowly. By 1892, the iron skeleton stood complete, dark against the sky, visible for miles. Local farmers would stop their work to stare at the strange structure taking shape on Hartford's hill. By 1893, half the glass panels were in place, and the building began to shimmer, catching light, throwing it back in ways that made the whole structure seem alive. Visitors to the Hartford estate could see, from the valley below, the glass palace growing. Some called it beautiful. Others called it mad. Local newspapers called it Hartford's folly. William called it Eden. The heating system proved to be the most complex element. A boiler house, built separate from the conservatory and connected by underground tunnels, housed two massive coal-fired boilers. Each stood 12 feet tall, constructed of riveted steel and cast iron. Together, they could generate enough steam to heat the entire mansion 3 times over. All of that power would go to the conservatory alone. The underground tunnels, lined with brick and fitted with iron doors every 50 feet, carried steam pipes from the boiler house to the conservatory. Inside the glass palace, a network of pipes ran beneath the tiled floors and along the walls, hidden behind plantings, invisible to visitors but essential to everything. 73 separate heating zones, each controlled by its own valve, allowed gardeners to maintain different temperatures in different sections. The tropical zone in the center would stay at 80 degrees. The temperate wings would hover near 70. The desert section would be kept intentionally cooler at night, mimicking its natural climate. By the autumn of 1894, the structure was complete. Glass walls rose toward the sky. Iron ribs curved overhead. The boilers sat ready in their house, cold but prepared. Empty glass rooms waited to be filled. And William Hartford needed someone who could keep 500 species alive through a Connecticut winter. He found his man in England. Ambrose Thorne was 35 years old in the spring of 1895. He had spent 13 years at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, rising from apprentice gardener to assistant curator of tropical species. He understood orchids, palms, ferns. He understood the delicate balance of temperature and humidity that kept exotic plants alive far from their native soil. He also understood that his career at Kew had reached its limit. He was the son of a country vicar. He had no family connections. He would never become head curator. The men who rose to those positions came from money, from the right schools, from families whose names opened doors. Ambrose would spend the rest of his life as assistant curator. Doing the work. Receiving none of the recognition. When the letter arrived from William Hartford, offering him the position of head gardener at Hartford Hall with a salary of $1,200 per year, Ambrose read it twice. Then he showed it to his wife, Margaret. "They're offering double what I make here." She looked at the letter, at the American postmark, at the elegant letterhead. America. Connecticut. Near New York. She folded the letter and handed it back. "Our son is 14. He'll have opportunities there we can't give him here." Ambrose wrote his acceptance that night. They arrived in Connecticut in late September of 1895. Ambrose, Margaret, and their son Philip, a quiet boy who had spent his childhood wandering the gardens at Kew, who could identify 100 species of ferns by the shape of their fronds. William Hartford met them at the train station personally. He drove them to the estate in his new motor car, one of only a dozen in Connecticut, pointing out landmarks along the way. The Farmington River, running cold and clear. The stone walls that marked the property boundaries, built a century ago by farmers whose descendants now worked Hartford's land. And then, as they crested a hill, the conservatory came into view. Ambrose stared. The glass palace caught the afternoon sun and seemed to explode with light. Every pane gleamed. The iron ribs curved upward like the skeleton of some impossible creature, organic and industrial at once. It was larger than he had imagined from the plans Hartford had sent. Far larger. The photographs had not captured the scale. The way it dominated the hillside. The way it seemed to defy every natural law. William pulled the motorcar to a stop at the base of the hill. "Can you do it? Can you keep 500 species alive through winter?" Ambrose looked at the building. At the boiler house behind it, steam already rising from its chimney in preparation. At the coal shed beside that, mountains of black fuel waiting to be consumed. He thought about the steam systems at Kew. The daily maintenance. The constant vigilance required. The nights he had stayed late, adjusting valves, checking temperatures, knowing that a single mistake could kill specimens worth more than his annual salary. And he thought about what would happen if the boilers failed on the coldest night of January. How long it would take for the temperature to drop. How quickly tropical plants would die when exposed to freezing air. He turned to William Hartford. "I can. But it will cost more than money." William smiled, not understanding. "Spare no expense, Mr. Thorne. Make it perfect." The first plants arrived in October of 1895. They came by railroad from Florida, California, and shipping ports where cargo vessels unloaded specimens from the tropics. Each crate was numbered according to the manifest. Each plant catalogued by species, origin, and approximate value. Palms arrived with root balls wrapped in burlap, 40 feet tall, their trunks thick as a man's waist, requiring 8 men and a custom-built crane to move into the conservatory. Some had traveled 3,000 miles. Some had nearly died in transport. Orchids came packed in moss, delicate and half-dead despite the care taken during their journey. Each one represented years of growth in its native habitat. Each one cost more than most men earned in a month. Ferns. Rubber trees. Banana plants. Coffee shrubs from Ethiopia. Bamboo from Japan. Bird of paradise from South Africa. Bromeliads from Brazil. 500 species in 3 months. Ambrose worked 18-hour days. His crew of 12 gardeners, hired from local farms and trained on site, struggled to keep pace. Each plant had specific requirements. Light. Water. Humidity. Temperature. Air circulation. Each needed its place within the carefully zoned conservatory. The tropical center, beneath the highest point of the glass dome, received the palms and banana trees. These were the most demanding. The most expensive. The most likely to die if conditions varied even slightly. The orchids went to the eastern wing, where morning light came filtered through trees outside, where the humidity could be kept higher than elsewhere. The temperate section housed ferns and species from Mediterranean climates. These were more forgiving. More likely to survive minor mistakes. Every night, Ambrose checked the boilers personally. He had trained the night fireman, a man named Gerald who understood the importance of maintaining precise temperatures. But Ambrose trusted no one completely. He monitored temperatures in each zone. He adjusted valves when needed. He recorded everything in a leather-bound ledger provided by Hartford. Every plant. Every adjustment. Every observation. This was the official record. William visited daily. He walked the aisles between plantings. He asked questions about species names, about native habitats, about the specific requirements of each zone. He wanted to understand every detail. He was, Ambrose realized, genuinely fascinated by the work. This was not a hobby for Hartford. This was a calling. An obsession. On a cold morning in early November, as the first snow began to fall, Ambrose stood beside William in the center of the conservatory. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the glass, already beginning to accumulate on the iron ribs, on the pathways, on the ground. Inside, the temperature held steady at 78 degrees. William looked up at the palm trees overhead. At the banana leaves unfurling, bright green and impossibly large. At the orchids beginning to bloom in the eastern wing, their petals opening to reveal colors that seemed too vivid to be real. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Ambrose nodded. But he was already thinking about the coal. About the 20 tons they would burn this winter. About the replacement plants they would inevitably need when losses occurred, because losses always occurred, no matter how perfect the conditions. He did not say any of this. Instead, he simply replied. "We've only just begun, Mr. Hartford. The Hartford Conservatory opened to the public on November 15, 1895. 3,000 visitors came in the first month. They arrived by carriage and the occasional motorcar. They paid 50 cents admission, a considerable sum but worth it for what waited inside. They walked the tiled pathways beneath palm trees that seemed impossible in Connecticut. They stood before orchids worth more than a year's wages for most workers. They breathed air that felt like summer in the dead of autumn. Women came in their finest dresses. Men in suits and top hats. Children pressed their faces to glass panels, looking at plants they had never imagined existed. The newspapers called it the Eighth Wonder. Hartford's Eden. A private tropical kingdom in the heart of New England. The stories spread. Harper's Weekly sent an illustrator. The New York Times ran a feature. Visitors came from Boston, from New York, from as far away as Philadelphia. William Hartford's brothers came for the opening gala. They walked the conservatory in silence, their expressions unreadable. Cornelius touched the trunk of a 40-foot palm, feeling the rough bark, looking up at fronds that blocked the view of the glass roof. Robert stood before a fountain where koi glided beneath lily pads, their scales catching light that filtered through the glass above. Neither said a word to William during the entire visit. But as they departed, Cornelius stopped at the entrance. William was there, greeting guests, accepting compliments, basking in the attention his creation had brought. Cornelius waited until the others had passed. Then he spoke, his voice low enough that only William could hear. "You've done something remarkable. I won't pretend to understand why. But you've done it." It was the closest thing to approval William would ever receive from his family. That night, alone in his study, exhausted but satisfied, William wrote in his diary. "I have built something that will outlast me. Something beautiful. Something that commands winter itself. And if this is madness, then I am content to be mad. But paradise has always come with a price." And what William Hartford did not yet know, what Ambrose Thorne was only beginning to understand, was that the true cost of glass palaces is measured not in dollars, but in blood and time and the slow erosion of everything we convince ourselves we can control. The snow fell heavier that night. The boilers roared in their underground house, consuming coal, generating steam, pushing heat through miles of pipe into a building that fought against every law of nature. And inside the conservatory, banana trees swayed in heated air. Orchids bloomed. Palm fronds rustled in artificial breezes created by carefully placed vents. Everything perfect. Everything unsustainable. Everything already beginning the long, slow process of dying that no amount of money or care or human will could ultimately prevent. 7 years passed. 7 winters came and went. 7 times, the snow piled against the glass walls of the Hartford Conservatory while inside, temperature never wavered from its tropical warmth. 7 times, the boilers consumed their weight in coal, and then consumed it again, endlessly hungry. 7 times, Ambrose Thorne and his crew of gardeners worked through nights that seemed to have no end. By the spring of 1902, Ambrose Thorne was 42 years old. He looked 60. His hair had gone gray at the temples first, then spread until almost no brown remained. His hands, once smooth from the gentle work of tending orchids at Kew, were now calloused and scarred. Burns from steam pipes that leaked when valves failed. Cuts from glass edges when panels cracked and needed replacement. The permanent stoop in his shoulders from years of bending over plants in air so humid it felt like drowning. His day began at 4 a.m. He would wake in the small cottage Hartford had built for him at the edge of the estate, a comfortable 2-story house with a garden that Margaret tended. She would already be awake, preparing coffee in the kitchen, the smell filling the house. Neither spoke much these early hours. There was nothing left to say that had not been said 1,000 times before. By 4:30, Ambrose was in the boiler house. The night fireman, Gerald, would be finishing his shift, his face blackened with coal dust, his eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. Together, They would check the coal levels in the massive bins that lined one wall. The steam pressure in both boilers, measured by brass gauges that had to be tapped to ensure accuracy. The water levels, critical because if they dropped too low, the boilers could explode. Everything had to be perfect. A single miscalculation, a moment of inattention, and the temperature in the conservatory could drop 10 degrees before anyone noticed. 10 degrees might not sound like much to someone who had never tended tropical plants. But for a Cattleya orchid from Colombia, for a banana tree from Sumatra, 10 degrees was the difference between life and death. By 5:30, Ambrose was walking the conservatory aisles. He carried his leather-bound ledger, the official record that Hartford reviewed monthly. He checked each section methodically. The tropical zone first, where the temperature should read 78 degrees and the humidity should hover around 75%. The eastern wing with its orchids, requiring 72 degrees and precisely 70% humidity. The temperate sections. The desert plantings, kept deliberately drier. He made notes. A palm showing signs of stress, its fronds yellowing at the tips. An orchid dropping buds prematurely, suggesting the temperature had fluctuated during the night. A fern with browning edges, indicating insufficient humidity or possibly too much direct light. Each note represented money. Replacement costs. Additional care. Sometimes the death of a specimen worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. By 7, the other gardeners arrived. There were 12 of them now, though the roster changed constantly. Young men from local farms who thought tending tropical plants in a glass palace would be easier than working fields. They learned quickly how wrong they were. They rarely lasted more than a season. The work was brutal in ways they could not anticipate. Summer was worst. Outside temperatures could reach 90 degrees. Inside the conservatory, with the glass magnifying the sun and the humidity held at tropical levels, temperatures climbed past 100. The air became soup. Breathing took effort. Moving felt like wading through water. The gardeners worked in shifts. 30 minutes inside. 30 minutes in the shade outside. 30 minutes inside. They drank water constantly, but it was never enough. Sweat poured off them, soaking through their clothes, puddling on the tiled floors. But even in winter, when outside air was cold and crisp, the conservatory demanded everything. The constant humidity rotted clothes within months. It turned leather brittle. It filled lungs with moisture that felt like drowning, that led to respiratory problems, chronic coughs that never quite went away. Men developed skin conditions from the combination of heat and humidity. Rashes that would not heal. Infections that required doctor visits and time away from work. The exhaustion was worst of all. The kind of exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. That settled into bones and stayed there. Ambrose had learned to recognize the signs. The moment a gardener started moving slower, when reactions dulled, when hands began to shake. When eyes went distant, when the man stopped sweating despite the heat, which meant his body was shutting down. He would pull them out immediately. Send them home. Better to be short-staffed than to risk what had happened before. Better to be short-staffed than to watch another young man die. By noon, Ambrose checked the deliveries. Plants still arrived regularly from around the world. William Hartford's appetite for rare specimens had not diminished. If anything, it had grown. Every few months, a new shipment. More orchids. A cycad from South Africa. Tree ferns from New Zealand. Bromeliads from Guatemala. Most arrived in terrible condition. The journey was too long, the care during transport inadequate, the shock of moving from one climate to another too severe. Many died within weeks despite everything Ambrose knew how to do. But Hartford wanted them anyway. Wanted the rarest, the most exotic, the most expensive. Wanted his collection to be unmatched anywhere in America. By 6 in the evening, Ambrose made his final rounds. He checked temperatures again, noting any fluctuations. Adjusted valves to compensate for the coming night. Made notes for the night crew, specific instructions about plants that needed watching. And then, before leaving, before walking back to his cottage and Margaret and dinner and a few hours of rest before tomorrow's 4 a.m. start, he opened his second ledger. This one, Hartford never saw. In it, Ambrose recorded everything the official records omitted. The true cost of maintaining paradise. He recorded the names of gardeners who quit after 3 months, lungs damaged from the constant humidity. The ones who lasted 6 months before their bodies gave out. The ones who stayed a full year and left with chronic health problems they would carry the rest of their lives. He recorded the exact tonnage of coal burned each month. 20 tons in November. 25 in December. 30 in January and February when outside temperatures dropped below zero. He recorded the plants that died despite perfect care. Their species names. Their country of origin. Their value in dollars, written beside their names like epitaphs. The injuries. The illnesses. The slow accumulation of damage that came from working in conditions human bodies were never meant to endure for extended periods. By the summer of 1902, Ambrose's secret ledger contained entries he wished he could forget. 3 deaths. Not from dramatic accidents. Nothing that made newspapers or forced Hartford to notice. Nothing that could be directly blamed on the conservatory in any official sense. Just men who wore out. Whose bodies gave up. Who went home sick one day and never recovered. Whose families received small payments from Hartford's estate and signed papers agreeing not to pursue any further claims. The official cause would be pneumonia, or heart failure, or exhaustion. The doctors, paid by Hartford, never connected it to the conservatory. Never suggested that working in tropical heat and humidity for years might have contributed to their deaths. But Ambrose knew. And he kept counting. August of 1902 brought a heat wave that broke records across New England. Outside temperatures climbed past 95 degrees day after day. The sun beat down without mercy. Crops withered in fields. Rivers ran low. People slept on their porches, seeking any breath of moving air. Inside the conservatory, despite every attempt to ventilate, despite opening every window and door, despite shutting down half the heating zones, the temperature reached 108 degrees in the tropical section. The plants could survive it. They were built for heat, for tropical summers where temperatures climbed even higher. Their leaves wilted during the day, then recovered at night. They were stressed but alive. The men were not built for this. Robert Sullivan was 22 years old. He had been working at the conservatory for 8 months. Strong, healthy, eager to please. He came from a farm family in the valley below Hartford's estate. Good people. Hard-working. He was saving money to buy his own land, to start his own family. He was a favorite among the other gardeners. Quick to laugh. Always willing to help with the hardest tasks. On the 3rd day of the heat wave, he was working in the tropical section, pruning dead fronds from a 40-foot palm tree. The work required him to climb a ladder, to reach up into the dense canopy where air did not move and heat collected like water in a bowl. Ambrose was in the eastern wing, checking orchids, when he heard the ladder fall. The sound carried through the conservatory. Metal clanging on tile. Loud enough to echo off the glass walls. He ran. Robert Sullivan lay on the tiled floor beneath the palm tree. The ladder was on its side 10 feet away. His face was red, flushed dark with blood. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His skin, when Ambrose touched him, burned like fever. Heat exhaustion. Ambrose had seen it before. Had experienced it himself more than once. Had learned to recognize the signs and pull men out before it progressed this far. But he had been in another section. He had not been watching closely enough. They carried Sullivan outside. 4 men, moving as fast as they could without dropping him. Laid him in the shade of an oak tree. Poured cold water from the well over him, soaking his clothes, his hair. Sent one of the younger gardeners running for the doctor. Sullivan's breathing did not improve. His pulse raced. His skin stayed hot despite the water. The doctor arrived within an hour, driving his buggy hard up the hill to the estate. He was Hartford's personal physician, a man who knew the conservatory, who had treated other gardeners for lesser ailments. He examined Sullivan quickly. Checked his pulse, his breathing, looked at his eyes, touched his burning skin. Then he looked up at Ambrose. Get him to a hospital. Now. They loaded him into a wagon. Drove him the 8 miles to the nearest hospital, going as fast as the horses could pull, hitting every rut in the road. Sullivan barely moved during the journey. His breathing grew more labored. His skin grew hotter still. Robert Sullivan died 6 hours later. His body temperature had reached 107 degrees. His organs had begun to fail. His heart gave out despite everything the doctors tried. There was nothing they could do. The damage was too severe. Ambrose sat in the hospital corridor. His hands shook. He could not stop them from shaking. When the doctor emerged, Ambrose stood. I should have seen it. I should have pulled him out sooner. The doctor looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been accusation. Mr. Thorne, no one can work in those conditions. Not safely. Not for long. You know this. We don't have a choice. The plants require. Everyone has a choice. But Ambrose knew better. The conservatory required maintenance. The plants required care. If they stopped, everything died. And Hartford had been clear from the beginning. From that first meeting 7 years ago. Spare no expense. Make it perfect. The expense was not supposed to include the lives of young men. But apparently it did. And apparently Hartford considered it an acceptable cost. William Hartford attended Robert Sullivan's funeral. He stood at the back of the small country church where the Sullivan family had worshipped for 3 generations. He wore black. He did not speak to the family during the service. Did not approach the grieving mother or the younger siblings who wept in the front pew. Afterward, he placed an envelope on the collection plate as he left. Inside was $500. More than Sullivan would have earned in 2 years. Enough to ease the immediate financial burden on a family that had just lost its primary wage earner. Not enough to replace a son. That evening, Hartford summoned Ambrose to his study. Ambrose had been dreading this conversation. He had rehearsed what he would say. How he would explain that the conditions were unsustainable. That they needed to reduce temperatures in summer, even if it stressed the tropical plants. That they needed more breaks, shorter shifts, better ventilation. That they needed to acknowledge the human cost of what they were attempting. Hartford sat behind his desk, surrounded by ledgers and papers. He looked tired. Older than his 52 years. The conservatory had been his obsession for 12 years now. It had consumed his fortune, his time, his every thought. But it had not cost him his health. He did not work in the heat. Did not breathe the humid air for 18 hours a day. Did not climb ladders in temperatures that could kill. I'm told you blame yourself for Sullivan's death. Ambrose stood near the door. He had not been invited to sit. I should have been watching more closely. Should have pulled him out before. Hartford raised a hand. It was a tragic accident. These things happen. We'll be more careful going forward. I've asked the architect to design additional ventilation for the tropical section. We'll install it before next summer. Ambrose felt something inside him shift. Something small but important. With respect, Mr. Hartford, it wasn't an accident. The conditions in summer are dangerous. We've been fortunate to only lose 1 man so far, but... Hartford's expression hardened. We continue, Mr. Thorne. We have the finest conservatory in America. Perhaps in the world. That requires dedication. Sullivan understood that. His family has been compensated generously. Ambrose chose his next words carefully. He's the third man who's died working here in 7 years. The words hung in the air between them. Hartford's expression did not change. 3 men out of how many who've worked here? Dozens? Perhaps 100. The risk is minimal. And the work is important. We're doing something remarkable. We're preserving species that might otherwise be lost. We're advancing botanical knowledge. We're creating beauty in a world that needs it. Are we? The question came out before Ambrose could stop it. Hartford looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was cold. You're tired, Mr. Thorne. Take a few days. Rest. When you return, we'll discuss the ventilation improvements and any other changes you think necessary. But we will not close the conservatory. We will not reduce our standards. We will not abandon what we've built. The meeting was over. Ambrose left the study. He walked back to his cottage through gardens that looked perfect in the twilight. Every hedge trimmed. Every flower bed weeded. Everything controlled and ordered and beautiful. Margaret was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the conservatory. The glass walls caught the light and glowed like they were on fire. She took one look at his face and knew. He doesn't see it, does he? The cost. Ambrose sat beside her. He sees what he wants to see. A magnificent achievement. A tribute to human ingenuity. He doesn't see Robert Sullivan's mother, who just buried her son. He doesn't see the men who quit every few months because their bodies can't take it. He doesn't see the truth. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said. Phillips applied to the horticultural program at Yale. Ambrose turned to her, surprised. When? Last month. He got his acceptance letter today. Their son was 21 now. A young man. Old enough to make his own choices. But Ambrose had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Philip would follow him into this work. That he would take over as head gardener when Ambrose retired. He wants to study botany. Research. Laboratory work. Teaching, perhaps. Margaret nodded. Not this. Ambrose looked back at the conservatory, visible from their porch, its glass walls darkening as the sun set behind it. He's smarter than I was. The years that followed brought a slow accumulation of truths that could not be ignored. By 1910, Ambrose had been at Hartford Hall for 15 years. He was 50 years old but felt 70. His ledger, the secret one, contained records that told a story William Hartford either could not or would not see. 7 deaths now. Not all dramatic. Not all directly attributable to the conservatory in ways that could be proven in court. But Ambrose knew the connection. The respiratory problems that turned into pneumonia. The heart attacks in men too young. The exhaustion that became illness that became death. 89 documented injuries over 15 years. Burns, falls, heat exhaustion that did not kill but left permanent damage. Broken bones from falling off ladders. Chronic respiratory problems. Skin conditions that never fully healed. 40% annual turnover in staff. The conservatory had employed over 200 men in 15 years. Most left within their first year. Some lasted longer. Very few stayed as long as 5 years. And the plants. 4,200 specimens had died despite expert care. Despite perfect conditions. Despite everything Ambrose knew how to do. The mortality rate for tropical plants in Connecticut, even with unlimited resources, was brutal. 50% died within 5 years. 80% within 10 years. Only a handful of the original 1895 plantings still survived. Hartford replaced them. He always replaced them. When an orchid died, he ordered 3 more. When a palm failed, he brought in 2 larger ones. The cost was astronomical, but he never hesitated. And the money. The money told its own story. $50,000 per year, Hartford had estimated in 1890. A staggering sum even then. But by 1910, the actual cost had climbed to $80,000 annually. $30,000 for coal alone. The boilers consumed it endlessly, day and night, month after month. 50 tons in November. 60 in December. 70 in January when the temperature dropped below zero and the boilers had to work harder to maintain tropical heat. 25,000 for labor. 12 full-time gardeners at $100 per month each. 20 men working the boiler house in rotating shifts. Additional workers for maintenance, repairs, improvements. 15,000 for plant replacement. Constant. Never-ending. The turnover of specimens that died and had to be replenished from increasingly difficult-to-access sources around the world. 10,000 for maintenance. Glass panels cracking from temperature stress and needing custom replacement. Iron frames rusting in the humidity despite regular painting. Pipes corroding from the constant passage of steam and needing sections replaced. The tiled floors that cracked and had to be releveled. Ambrose knew these numbers intimately. He tracked them in his private ledger. And he knew something else that Hartford seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge. The conservatory cost more to operate than the entire 250-room mansion combined. The mansion housed 25 staff. Required heating only during winter months. Needed repairs and maintenance but nothing approaching the constant demands of the conservatory. The conservatory was a machine that consumed everything. Money. Coal. Human health. Plant life. All of it fed into the glass palace and converted into something beautiful but fundamentally unsustainable. Ambrose understood this. Had understood it for years. But Hartford did not want to hear it. And Ambrose needed the salary, needed the cottage, needed the security for Margaret and for their future. So he stayed. And kept counting. That breaking point came in the form of William Hartford's brothers. In the spring of 1912, Cornelius Jr. and Robert Hartford requested a formal meeting with their younger brother. Not a casual visit. A business meeting, with the family accountant present. Legal papers prepared. William tried to dismiss it. He was 52 years old now. His fortune was his own, separate from the railroad business his brothers managed. He owed them no explanations. But the accountant was insistent. There were concerns. Questions about William's finances. Concerns that, if left unaddressed, could affect the entire Hartford family. Reluctantly, William agreed. The meeting took place in his study on a Tuesday afternoon. His brothers arrived together. The accountant, a thin man named Morrison who had managed Hartford family finances for 30 years, carried a leather satchel filled with ledgers. They sat. Morrison spread papers across William's desk. Then he began. Your estate is currently losing approximately $50,000 per year. William looked at the numbers. Frowned. That's impossible. My investments generate substantial income. Morrison nodded. Your investments generate approximately $130,000 annually. A respectable sum. However, your expenses, between the mansion, the various properties, the staff, and the conservatory, total approximately $180,000. He tapped a column of numbers. The conservatory alone accounts for nearly half your annual expenses. $80,000. Every single year. William studied the ledger more carefully. For the first time, truly studied it rather than glancing at the summary page Morrison typically provided. The numbers were exact. Undeniable. Cornelius leaned forward. This has been going on for over 10 years, William. You've spent more than $1 million maintaining that glass building. $1 million that's gone forever. That's produced nothing except the satisfaction of your own interests. It's not gone. It's created something remarkable. It's preserved species. Advanced botanical knowledge. Created beauty. Robert cut him off. It's created nothing. It produces no income. It serves no purpose beyond your own vanity. And it's destroying your fortune. Morrison cleared his throat, trying to maintain professional neutrality. At current rates, you have perhaps 10 years before serious reductions become necessary. Selling properties. Reducing staff. Possibly, closing the conservatory itself. Never. The word came out harder than William intended. Never. Then you need to reduce expenses elsewhere. Dramatically. William stood. The meeting was over, whether his brothers agreed or not. Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern. But my finances are my own affair. I will manage them as I see fit. His brothers exchanged glances. They had expected this. William had always been stubborn. Always been blind to practical realities when they conflicted with what he wanted. Morrison gathered his papers slowly. Mr. Hartford, I'm obligated to inform you that your current path is unsustainable. If you continue at this rate, bankruptcy is not merely possible. It's probable. William said nothing. Simply waited for them to leave. When they were gone, he sat alone in his study for a long time. He looked out the window at the conservatory, visible on the hillside, its glass walls catching the afternoon light. He thought about closing it. About selling off the plants. About dismissing the staff and letting the building sit empty. He tried to imagine his life without it. He couldn't. That night, William Hartford walked through his conservatory alone. He looked at the palms, now 17 years old, that had been among the first plantings. The orchids, some of which bloomed reliably year after year. The banana trees bearing fruit in the middle of a Connecticut spring. And for the first time, he wondered if his brothers might be right. But even thinking that thought felt like betrayal. William Hartford's response to financial reality was not to reduce his spending on the conservatory. It was to increase it. He began collecting orchids with renewed fervor. If the conservatory was expensive, then it would be spectacular. If it was unsustainable, then it would be unforgettable. If his fortune was dying, then at least it would die for something beautiful. By 1915, Hartford's orchid collection numbered over 200 specimens. Some cost $50. Some cost $500. A few cost over $1,000 each. A single plant worth more than a skilled worker earned in 2 years. The mortality rate was brutal. Orchids are temperamental in ways that other plants are not. They require precise conditions. Slight variations in temperature, humidity, air flow, and they begin to die. Sometimes slowly, over months. Sometimes overnight, their roots rotting, their leaves yellowing, their flowers dropping. Ambrose estimated that 50% of Hartford's orchids died within 5 years. They would bloom once, perhaps twice, spectacular displays of color and fragrance. And then they would begin their decline into a death that no amount of care could reverse. Hartford would simply order replacements. 3 new orchids for every one that died. The most expensive ones. The rarest ones. One afternoon in the summer of 1915, Ambrose found himself standing before a Cattleya orchid that had just arrived from Colombia. It had cost Hartford $1,200. It was magnificent. Blood-red petals streaked with gold, each bloom as large as a dinner plate. A fragrance that filled the entire eastern wing with a scent like cinnamon and vanilla and something wilder. It would be dead within 3 years. Ambrose knew this. He had seen it dozens of times. The pattern was predictable. The orchid would bloom spectacularly for a season, maybe two. Then it would begin its decline. The leaves would yellow at the edges. The roots would rot despite perfect watering. And nothing Ambrose did would save it. Some plants were simply not meant to live in Connecticut. No matter how perfect the conditions, no matter how expert the care, they knew at some level that they were in the wrong place. And eventually, they gave up. Ambrose made a note in his ledger. Date received. Species. Cost. Projected lifespan. Hartford appeared beside him, moving quietly for a large man. Beautiful, isn't it? Ambrose nodded. Magnificent, sir. Worth every penny. Ambrose said nothing. He had learned, over the years, that Hartford did not want to hear certain truths. Did not want to be reminded that this particular orchid represented more money than most families earned in 5 years. Did not want to acknowledge that it was already dying, that its death was written in its genetics, that bringing it to Connecticut was sentencing it to a slow suicide. Hartford reached out and touched one of the petals gently. His hand was steady. His expression peaceful. I've received word of an even rarer specimen. A Phalaenopsis from the Philippines. Supposedly, there are only 3 in cultivation outside their native country. I've arranged to acquire one. How much? 1,500. Ambrose kept his expression neutral, though his stomach turned. That's a significant investment. Everything worthwhile requires investment, Mr. Thorne. Surely you understand that by now. Hartford walked away, already thinking about where the new orchid would be placed, what care it would require, how spectacular it would look. Ambrose stood before the cattleya, with its blood-red petals and its death already written in an invisible script only he could read. That evening, he added another entry to his secret ledger. The conservatory had become more than unsustainable. It had become a kind of madness. A beautiful, ruinously expensive madness that Hartford could not or would not abandon. A fevered dream that had infected Hartford's entire life, that consumed his fortune and his time and his every thought. And Ambrose understood, with a clarity that felt like grief, that he was witnessing something that could not last. That the only question was not if it would end, but how, and how much damage it would cause when it finally did. The answer came from a direction none of them expected. On April 6, 1917, the United States Congress declared war on Germany. America entered the Great War. And with war came rationing. The War Industries Board was established to coordinate industrial production. Coal, steel, rubber, grain, everything that powered the war effort fell under government control. Resources had to be allocated. Priorities had to be set. Some things were essential. Some were not. Including the coal that heated conservatories. The letter arrived at Hartford Hall on August 15, 1917. Ambrose was the one who found it, sorting through the morning mail as he did every day before Hartford came down for breakfast. An official envelope. Government seal. Addressed to William Hartford, Esquire. He knew immediately what it was. Had been expecting it for months. Had read in newspapers about similar directives being sent to estates across New England. He brought it to Hartford's study. Hartford was at his desk, reviewing plant catalogs. Planning his next acquisitions. He looked up as Ambrose entered. What is it? Ambrose handed him the envelope without a word. Hartford opened it. Read it once. Then read it again, more slowly. His face went pale. He handed the letter to Ambrose silently. The directive was clear. All non-essential uses of coal were to be reduced by 60% effective immediately. Conservatories were specifically listed as non-essential luxury structures. Compliance was mandatory. Failure to comply would result in federal charges and possible seizure of all coal supplies. Estate owners had 30 days to implement the reduction. Ambrose looked up from the letter. 60% less coal. Hartford nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. What will that do to the temperature? Ambrose did the calculation in his head. He had run these numbers before, in idle moments, wondering what would happen if they ever had to reduce heat. The conservatory currently maintained an average temperature of 75 to 80 degrees, depending on the zone. The boilers burned approximately 60 tons of coal per month during winter. A 60% reduction would mean 36 tons per month less. The temperature would drop to 55 degrees, perhaps 60 on warm days. He looked at Hartford. Everything will die. Every tropical plant. Every orchid. The palms, the banana trees, everything we've spent 22 years building. All of it will die. Hartford stood. He walked to the window. Outside, the conservatory was visible on the hillside, its glass walls catching the late summer sun, looking perfect and eternal. There has to be a way. We can reduce temperature gradually. Focus heat on the most valuable specimens. Close off sections to concentrate warmth. Ambrose shook his head. The system doesn't work that way, sir. The heating pipes run throughout the entire structure. We can't selectively heat individual zones without shutting down others completely. And if we reduce coal by 60%, the entire structure drops to 55 degrees. There's no way around it. Hartford turned from the window. How long would they survive at that temperature? Ambrose thought about the tropical plants. Species that evolved in climates where temperature never dropped below 70 degrees. Where humidity stayed constant. Where seasons meant wet or dry, not warm or cold. A week. Perhaps 2. Then they start dying. Within a month, we'll lose 90% of everything. The orchids will go first. Then the tropicals. The palms might last a few months, but even they'll die eventually. Hartford's voice was barely audible. Is there any way to save them? Ambrose thought about the plants. 22 years of collection. Specimens from every corner of the world. Some irreplaceable. Some worth thousands of dollars. Some that Hartford had watched grow from seedlings to mature specimens. We could try to donate them. Botanical gardens with better insulation. Greenhouses in warmer climates. California, perhaps. But most won't survive the transport. And most institutions don't have space for hundreds of additional specimens. Hartford closed his eyes. Do it. Contact every botanical garden within reach. Every collector. Every institution. Offer them whatever they want. Pay for transport. Save what can be saved. And the rest? Hartford's voice cracked. The rest we watch die. The next 3 weeks were among the worst of Ambrose Thorne's life. He wrote letters. Dozens of them. To the New York Botanical Garden. To botanical institutions in Philadelphia, Washington, Boston. To private collectors in Florida and California. To anyone who might have space and resources to take some of Hartford's collection. He explained the situation. The war. The coal rationing. The imminent closure. He offered the plants free. Offered to pay for transport. Offered Hartford's expertise and documentation for every specimen. Most responded with polite refusals. Their own facilities were full. They had no space for hundreds of additional specimens. They faced their own coal restrictions and could not take on additional burdens. Some expressed sympathy. War was difficult for everyone. These were necessary sacrifices. Surely Mr. Hartford understood. A few accepted small numbers. The New York Botanical Garden agreed to take 20 orchids, the ones with the best documentation and clearest scientific value. A private collector in Florida offered to take some of the palms, if Hartford paid for transport and crating, which would cost nearly $1,000. In total, they managed to rehome perhaps 10% of the collection. 40 plants out of nearly 500. The rest would stay. And die. On September 10, 1917, Ambrose Thorne reduced the coal supply to the boilers by 60%, as required by federal law. The temperature in the conservatory began to drop immediately. Within hours, the difference was noticeable. The thick, humid warmth that had filled the building for 22 years began to thin. The air felt lighter. Less oppressive. Almost comfortable. The plants noticed before the humans did. By the second day, the temperature had fallen to 65 degrees. Orchids that were preparing to bloom dropped their buds. Banana trees stopped growing. Palm fronds that had been reaching toward the glass roof seemed to pause, to hesitate. By the fourth day, 60 degrees. The tropical species began showing visible stress. Brown spots appeared on banana leaves. The great palms, 40 feet tall, started dropping fronds. Ferns that had thrived for decades began to yellow at the edges. By the end of the first week, 58 degrees. The orchids went first. Within days, dozens showed signs of dying. Leaves yellowing. Roots rotting. Flowers dropping. Within 2 weeks, half of Hartford's 200 specimen collection was dead or dying. Ambrose walked the conservatory daily. He made notes in his official ledger, though Hartford never asked to see it anymore. He did what little he could, but there was nothing to be done. The temperature was simply too cold for plants that required tropical warmth. He felt like a doctor watching patients die one by one, unable to do anything but record their decline. The other gardeners became demoralized. They had spent years tending these plants. Had developed relationships with them, strange as that might sound. Had taken pride in keeping rare and difficult species alive. Now they were watching everything die. Some quit. Couldn't bear to witness it. Others stayed, but their hearts weren't in the work anymore. What was the point of watering and pruning plants that were already dead? Hartford came once in late September. He stood in the center of the tropical zone, surrounded by dying plants. The palms overhead were already browning, their fronds hanging limp. The air, once humid and thick, now felt clammy and wrong. The temperature was 58 degrees. Cool enough that Hartford could see his breath in the morning. He said nothing. He simply stood there for nearly an hour, walking slowly through aisles he had walked thousands of times, looking at plants he had watched grow for over 2 decades. Ambrose waited near the entrance, giving him privacy. Finally, Hartford walked toward him. His face was pale. His eyes red. Close it. Shut everything down. I can't watch this anymore. Ambrose nodded slowly. What about the few specimens that might survive if we can keep them slightly warmer? If we... Hartford shook his head. Close it. Today. Lock the doors. Dismiss the staff except for minimal maintenance. We're done. That afternoon, Ambrose shut down the boilers completely. He sent the gardeners home with 2 weeks' severance pay. He locked the conservatory doors with a key that felt impossibly heavy in his hand. And for the first time in 22 years, the glass palace went cold. By October, the temperature inside matched the temperature outside. By November, the first frost came. Ice formed on the inside of the glass panels. The condensation that had always fogged the windows now froze into delicate patterns. And by December, when snow began to pile against the glass walls, everything inside was dead. William Hartford did not visit the conservatory again that winter. He could not bear to see what his dream had become. A glass tomb. Full of the corpses of plants that should never have been in Connecticut in the first place. Ambrose Thorne, for his part, felt something he had not expected. Relief. The war ended on November 11, 1918. Church bells rang across Connecticut. People poured into the streets of every town and village. Newsboys shouted headlines about armistice and peace and the boys coming home. Strangers embraced. Grown men wept. William Hartford, 58 years old now, stood in his study and looked out at the conservatory. For 13 months, it had stood empty. The glass walls were intact, though some panels had cracked during the winter and gone unrepaired. The iron frame showed signs of rust but no structural damage. The boilers waited in their underground house, cold and silent, ready to be restarted. But inside, everything was dead. The palms that had soared 40 feet high were brown skeletons, their trunks splitting from the freeze. The banana trees had collapsed into rotting piles during the spring thaw. The orchids, every single one of Hartford's 200 specimens, were dried husks clinging to their pots. Even the tile floors were damaged, cracked from the repeated freeze-thaw cycles. 22 years of collection. Over $1 million spent. Gone in a single winter of enforced cold. Hartford had not set foot inside since the day he ordered it closed. Could not bring himself to witness the destruction. But now the war was over. Coal rationing would end soon. Life would return to normal. Industries would restart. The economy would recover. And Hartford began to wonder if the conservatory could live again. He summoned Ambrose Thorne in late November of 1918. Ambrose was 58 now, the same age as Hartford. The war years had been kind to him in ways the conservatory years had not. With the glass palace closed, his duties had reduced to maintaining the outdoor gardens and the grounds. He worked normal hours. 8 to 5. Weekends off. He slept through the night for the first time in 20 years. Margaret noticed the change in him immediately. The color returning to his face. The way he stood straighter. How he smiled more easily. Philip, now graduated from Yale with a degree in botany and working as a researcher in Boston, noticed too when he visited for holidays. His father seemed lighter somehow. As if a weight had been lifted that he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. When Hartford's summons came, delivered by a servant to Ambrose's cottage on a cold Tuesday morning, Ambrose felt that weight settle back onto his shoulders. He walked to the main house slowly. Entered Hartford's study. Sat in the chair opposite the desk where he had sat so many times before. Hartford looked older. The war years had been hard on everyone, but Hartford seemed to have aged more than 2 years. His hair was completely white now. His face had the gaunt look of someone who had not been sleeping well. Deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Mr. Thorne. Thank you for coming. Ambrose waited. He knew what was coming. Hartford folded his hands on the desk. The war is over. Coal rationing will end within months. I want to reopen the conservatory. Ambrose had expected this. Had dreaded it. Had practiced what he would say. Mr. Hartford, the cost to completely restock would be approximately $150,000. Perhaps more. Many of the suppliers we used before the war are no longer in business. Some of the species we had, particularly the rarer orchids, may no longer be available at any price. The war disrupted trade routes, closed borders. What took us 5 years to collect originally might take a decade now. Hartford nodded, as if he had already considered this. I'm prepared for that investment. And the annual operating costs would return to what they were before the war. $80,000 per year at minimum. Possibly more, if coal prices have increased. Hartford was quiet for a moment, looking past Ambrose to the window, where the conservatory was visible on the hillside. What if we reduced the scope? Fewer species. Focus on the most resilient plants, the ones most likely to survive. Reduce temperatures slightly to save coal. Make it more sustainable. Ambrose shook his head gently. The building is designed for tropical temperatures. It's all or nothing. We learned that lesson during the war. Reduce it too much and even hardy plants die. We can't half heat a space that large. The system doesn't allow for it. We either maintain proper tropical conditions, or we have a cold greenhouse that won't support anything exotic. Hartford stood. He walked to the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. Light flurries that would amount to nothing, but beautiful in the afternoon light. I built something remarkable, Mr. Thorne. Something that had never existed before. Something that brought beauty and wonder into thousands of lives. I can't let it end like this. Empty. Dead. A monument to failure. Ambrose felt a profound sadness for this man who could not let go. Sometimes things end despite what we want. Despite what we've invested. The conservatory was magnificent. I was proud to be part of it. But the war showed us the truth. It was always too expensive. Too fragile. Too dependent on conditions we couldn't control. He paused, then continued quietly. We can rebuild it. We can restock it. We can try to recreate what we had. But we'll just be delaying the inevitable. Eventually, something else will happen. Another war. An economic downturn. An illness that prevents you from maintaining it. And we'll be right back where we are now. Are you saying you won't help me? Ambrose looked at Hartford's back. At the tension in his shoulders. At the desperate need to recapture something that was already gone. Mr. Hartford, I've worked for you for 23 years. I've given you everything I know how to give. But I'm 58 years old. My health is not what it was. The years in the conservatory took their toll. I don't think I can do this again. Hartford turned from the window. His expression had hardened. I'll double your salary. $2,400 per year. It's not about money, sir. Then what is it about? Ambrose stood. It's about knowing when something is finished. The conservatory was magnificent. But it's done. And trying to bring it back won't change that fact. Hartford's voice was cold when he spoke. You're dismissed, Mr. Thorne. Ambrose left the study. Walked back to his cottage through gardens that were preparing for winter. Margaret was in the kitchen, baking bread. The smell filled the house. She looked at him and knew immediately. He wants to reopen it. Ambrose sat at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted. I told him I can't do it again. Margaret put her hand on his. Good. William Hartford did attempt to reopen the conservatory without Ambrose. He hired a new head gardener in the spring of 1919. A younger man, 35 years old, from Massachusetts. Excellent credentials from the Arnold Arboretum. Enthusiastic. Confident. No experience with operations at this scale, but eager to learn. They restarted the boilers that April. Ordered new plants from suppliers who had survived the war. Attempted to recreate what had been lost. It lasted 18 months. The new gardener quit after the first winter. The work was more brutal than he had anticipated. The costs spiraled beyond what Hartford had budgeted. The replacement plants, rushed and poorly acclimated, died at rates even higher than before. The heating system, after sitting cold for over 2 years, developed problems that required expensive repairs. By the autumn of 1920, Hartford gave up. He closed the conservatory for the second time. Dismissed the remaining staff. Locked the doors. This time, he did not promise to reopen it. Did not talk about future plans. Did not pretend it was temporary. It was finished. Ambrose heard about it from other estate staff. He felt no satisfaction in being right. Only a deep, quiet sadness for a dream that had never been sustainable, for a man who had poured his fortune and his life into something that could not last. He retired officially in 1920, at age 60. Hartford gave him a generous pension. $1,000 per year for life. Use of the cottage for as long as he wanted it. They shook hands in Hartford's study. They said the polite things men say when a long professional relationship ends. Hartford thanked him for his years of service. Ambrose wished him well. Neither mentioned the ledger Ambrose had kept for 25 years. The secret accounting of the true costs. The deaths and injuries and money and plants all recorded in neat columns that told a story Hartford had never wanted to hear. Ambrose and Margaret moved to a small house in Vermont that winter. A place Philip helped them find, near enough to Boston that he could visit regularly. And Ambrose tried to forget the glass palace. Tried to forget the smell of damp earth and jasmine. Tried to forget the men who had died in the heat. Tried to forget 25 years of his life spent maintaining paradise that was never meant to exist. The 1920s were difficult years for men like William Hartford. The old fortunes, built on railroads and steel and the Industrial Revolution, began to erode. New industries rose. Automobiles. Radio. Aviation. Motion pictures. New names. New money. The world was changing in ways the previous generation could not have anticipated. Hartford's investments declined. His brothers, who had managed the family railroad business while William played with plants, had made poor decisions during the war years. The Hartford Railroad empire was shrinking, losing routes to competitors, struggling with new regulations and labor disputes. The conservatory stood empty on its hillside. Glass panels cracked from temperature stress and went unrepaired. Iron frames rusted in the weather, no longer protected by constant heat and humidity. Weeds grew in the tiled pathways inside, their seeds blown in through broken panes. Hartford could have demolished it. Sold the glass and iron for scrap. Recovered some small fraction of what he had invested. But he could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he simply let it decay. A monument to something he could no longer remember clearly. A dream that had consumed nearly 30 years and over $1 million and left him with nothing but regrets and an empty building slowly falling apart. By 1925, the Hartford fortune was in serious trouble. The railroad business continued to decline. Hartford's personal investments, never diversified enough, lost value year after year. By 1927, his brothers were urging him to sell properties. The Newport estate. Land holdings that generated no income. Anything that could raise cash. By 1929, when the stock market crashed in October and the Great Depression began, William Hartford was nearly broke. The collapse came quickly once it started. October 1929. Black Tuesday. The market crashed. Hartford's remaining investments, already weakened by years of poor performance, became worthless overnight. Stock certificates that had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were suddenly worth nothing. By 1930, Hartford could not pay his full staff. He began dismissing servants. Closing sections of the mansion. Living in just a few rooms. By 1931, he was behind on property taxes. The state sent notices. Threatened seizure. By 1932, his brothers intervened forcibly. They had no choice. The family name was at stake. They arranged the sale of Hartford Hall to a development company based in New York. William would be allowed to remain in a small wing of the mansion, 6 rooms, for the rest of his life. But everything else, including the conservatory, belonged to the developers now. The sale price was $500,000. A fraction of what the estate was worth, but Hartford was in no position to negotiate. The developers had no interest in glass palaces or tropical plants or the dreams of a man who had bankrupted himself on orchids. They wanted the land. The timber. The river access. The property could be subdivided into dozens of lots and sold to wealthy families from New York looking for country estates. On March 15, 1933, demolition began. William Hartford, 73 years old now, watched from the window of his study. The same window where he had stood so many times over 38 years, looking at his creation with pride, with satisfaction, with the certainty that he had built something that would outlast him. Men with sledgehammers broke the glass. The sound carried across the estate. Sharp cracks. Tinkling cascades. The destruction of something that had taken 5 years to build happened in a single afternoon. Each panel shattered. Each piece fell. The sound must have been like the end of the world to Hartford, watching from his window. The iron frames were cut apart with torches, sparks flying, metal glowing orange then fading to black. Loaded onto trucks. Sold for scrap. 40 tons of cast iron, melted down, turned into something useful. Maybe farm equipment. Maybe parts for automobiles. Maybe rebar for buildings in New York. The glass was worthless. Most of it was simply buried on site, in pits dug by excavators, covered over with dirt. The boiler house was dismantled piece by piece. The great boilers that had run day and night for 22 years were cut apart and hauled away. The underground tunnels were filled in. The pipes removed. The brick walls collapsed and covered. By the end of the week, nothing remained but the foundation. A rectangular scar on the hillside where the conservatory had stood. Where Hartford's dream had lived and died. William Hartford was 73 years old. He had outlived his dream by 16 years since its first closure in 1917. And he would outlive its final demolition by 14 more. Ambrose Thorne died in his sleep on a cold night in February of 1942. He was 82 years old. He had lived 22 years beyond his time at Hartford Hall. Good years, mostly. Quiet years spent with Margaret in their Vermont home. Years watching his son Philip build a distinguished career in botany without the brutal conditions that had nearly destroyed his father. The ledger sat in a trunk in Ambrose's study. He had kept it all these years. Had added entries occasionally, updating records as he learned of other conservatories closing, other men dying, other fortunes consumed by glass palaces that could not be sustained. When Margaret died 6 months after Ambrose, their son Philip inherited the house and its contents. He found the ledger in the spring of 1943, while sorting through his father's papers. At first, he did not understand what he was reading. Lists of dates. Names he did not recognize. Injuries described in clinical detail. Deaths recorded with cause and date. Financial records tracking expenditures year by year. Plant mortality rates. Species names. Values in dollars. Then he understood. His father had kept a complete accounting of the Hartford Conservatory's true costs. Not the costs William Hartford acknowledged in official records. Not the expenses reported to accountants or discussed in meetings with architects. But the real costs. The hidden costs. The costs Hartford had never seen or never wanted to see. Philip was a scientist. A researcher. He recognized the value of the data immediately. He took the ledger to a historian at Yale, a professor who specialized in the Gilded Age and the great estates of New England. The historian read it in one sitting. 3 hours in his office while Philip waited, watching the man's expression change as he turned pages. When he finished, he looked up. "This needs to be published." Philip hesitated. "Will it hurt anyone? My father is dead. Mr. Hartford is still alive, I think. I don't want to damage anyone's reputation for no purpose." The historian shook his head. "Hartford is nearly broke. Living in a corner of his old mansion. He has no reputation left to damage. But this ledger, this data, it tells a story that needs to be told. It's not about attacking Hartford. It's about understanding what happened. Why these buildings failed. What they really cost." Philip thought for a moment, then agreed. The book was published in 1945. The Hidden Cost of Glass Palaces, a gardener's account of America's lost conservatories. It used Ambrose Thorne's ledger as its foundation, but the historian had done extensive additional research over 2 years. He had found records from other estates, other conservatories, other men who had kept their own quiet accountings of costs that owners never wanted to acknowledge. The numbers, when compiled across all 200 conservatories that had been built between 1880 and 1920, were staggering. The documented deaths, gleaned from cemetery records and newspaper accounts and private ledgers like Ambrose's, totaled 21. Heat exhaustion, accidents, respiratory failures, heart attacks in men too young. The documented injuries numbered in the hundreds. Burns, falls, chronic respiratory problems, health conditions that lasted the rest of these men's lives. The turnover rate averaged 40% annually across all conservatories. Thousands of men had worked in these buildings over 50 years. Most for less than a year. The work was simply too brutal to sustain for longer. The financial costs were equally staggering. Conservative estimates put the collective construction costs at over $400 million in 1945 currency. Operating costs over 50 years approached $15 billion cumulative. And for what? By 1945, when the book was published, fewer than 10 of those 200 conservatories still existed. The survivors had one thing in common. Every single one had transitioned from private ownership to public institutions. Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania. Built by Pierre DuPont, opened to the public in 1921. Now operated by a foundation with an endowment approaching $50 million. Annual operating costs exceeded $5 million per year. Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh. Opened to the public in 1893, had never been private. City-owned from the beginning. Maintained by public funds and an army of 300 volunteers. The Enid A. Haupt Conservatory at the New York Botanical Garden. Institutional from its inception in 1902. Never dependent on a single family's fortune. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Private wealth, no matter how vast, could not sustain conservatories. The operating costs were too high. The maintenance too constant. The return on investment non-existent. Only public ownership, with diversified funding sources and institutional support, could keep glass palaces alive. The private dream of commanding winter had always been unsustainable. Every single attempt had failed. Every family that had tried to maintain these buildings privately had eventually been forced to close them or give them away. The book's conclusion was stark. The glass conservatories of the Gilded Age were monuments to human ambition and technological achievement. But they were also monuments to hubris. To the belief that private wealth and personal will could sustain anything. That expense was the only barrier between dream and reality. History has proven otherwise. The glass palaces rose because technology made them possible and fortunes made them irresistible. They fell because unsustainability always fails, eventually. No matter how much money. No matter how much desire. Some things simply cannot be maintained by individual effort alone. William Hartford died on January 3, 1947. He was 87 years old. He died in his sleep in the small apartment he occupied in what had once been his mansion, in rooms that had once housed servants, now divided and rented to others. He had outlived his brothers. Outlived his fortune. Outlived the conservatory by 14 years since its demolition, by 30 years since its first closure. His obituary in the New York Times was brief. 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his family's railroad empire. It noted his contributions to horticulture and his support of botanical institutions. It did not mention the conservatory specifically. But locally, in Connecticut, people remembered. The old man who had built the glass palace. Who had spent a fortune trying to keep summer alive in winter. Who had lost everything chasing a dream that could not survive contact with reality. Philip Thorne attended the funeral. He was 66 now, a respected professor at Boston University, the author of several important papers on plant physiology. His father's son, but without the scars. He stood at the back of the small church and thought about Ambrose. About the years his father had spent tending plants that were always dying. About the ledger that had documented the truth Hartford never acknowledged. About the book that had finally told that truth to the world. After the service, Philip drove to the Hartford estate. The mansion had been converted into apartments. The grounds were overgrown. The developers had never followed through on their plans to subdivide the property. The Depression had killed those dreams too. He walked to where the conservatory had stood. The foundation was still visible, though weeds and saplings had grown up through the cracks. Trees had started to reclaim the space. In another decade, the forest would swallow the last evidence that anything had ever been here. Philip stood there for a long time, in the place where his father had spent 25 years of his life. Then he noticed something. Growing in a crack in the foundation, a small orchid. Not one of the cultivated species his father had tended. Not an exotic treasure from Java or Colombia or the Philippines. A native orchid. Cypripedium. Pink lady's slipper. Common in New England woods. Worth nothing in monetary terms.
It had seeded itself here. Grown on its own. Survived without boilers or gardeners or endless expense.
Philip knelt down and looked at it closely. Healthy. Thriving. Blooming in the ruins of the glass palace. He smiled. Nature persists. Human monuments crumble. He stood up, took one last look around, and walked back to his car. Today, fewer than 10 Gilded Age conservatories survive in the United States. Each one tells the same story. Public ownership. Institutional support. Multiple funding sources. Professional staff. Volunteer armies. Endowments in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania requires $5 million annually in operating costs. A staff of 200 full-time employees. Volunteers numbering in the hundreds. An endowment of over $100 million. Without all of that, it would close within a year. The costs are simply too high for any other arrangement to work. Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh survives on a combination of city funding, state grants, federal support, and private donations. Remove any piece of that complex funding structure and the building becomes unsustainable. The New York Botanical Gardens Conservatory requires constant climate control upgrades. Energy efficiency improvements. Modern technology that William Hartford could never have imagined. And still, the costs are enormous. Still, it requires an institution with deep pockets and diverse support. These surviving structures exist not because someone loved plants enough to pay any price. They exist because multiple funding sources, institutional structures, and public support came together in ways that private wealth alone could never achieve. The 191 conservatories that died took different paths to the same end. Some, like Hartford's, simply bankrupted their owners. The Depression finished what unsustainable spending had started. Some were demolished during World War II. The metal was needed for the war effort. Glass palaces became tanks and ships and bullets. Priority went to survival, not beauty. Some lasted into the 1950s and 1960s, maintained by families who refused to let go until age and deterioration made the choice for them. Until iron frames rusted through. Until glass panels cracked beyond repair. Until heating systems failed and the cost to replace them exceeded the value of keeping the buildings alive. But all of them shared the same fundamental flaw. They were built on the assumption that private wealth and personal will could sustain anything. That technology had made the impossible merely expensive. That expense was the only barrier between dream and reality. They were wrong. The Hartford Hall estate today is a condominium complex. The mansion, renovated and divided in the 1970s, houses 40 families. The grounds have been parceled into lots. Small houses dot the hillside where Hartford's gardens once spread. The view of the Farmington River, once William Hartford's private vista, is now shared by weekend joggers and dog walkers who have no idea what this place once was. The conservatory site is a community garden. Raised beds. Tomatoes and herbs. Zucchini and peppers. A small greenhouse, modest and practical, maintained by the Homeowners Association. Nothing exotic. Nothing expensive. Just practical plants that grow well in Connecticut. There is a historical marker. Bronze plaque on a granite post, installed in 1985 by the State Historical Society. Site of the Hartford Conservatory. 1895 to 1933, one of America's great glass palaces. Most residents walk past without reading it. But occasionally, someone stops. Reads the dates. Does the math. 38 years. Wonders what it looked like. What it must have cost. Why it's gone now. The plaque does not mention the 7 men who died working there. Or the hundreds who were injured. Or the millions of dollars consumed keeping plants alive in the wrong climate. It does not mention Ambrose Thorne's ledger. Or the truth that took 50 years to be published. Or the lesson that no one wanted to learn. It simply marks the spot where something magnificent and unsustainable once stood. In our time, America has no shortage of monuments to excess. A $500 million yacht that sits unused 11 months of the year. Private jets burning thousands of gallons of fuel for 1-hour flights that could be taken on commercial aircraft. Mansions of 50,000 square feet housing 2 people. Cryptocurrency fortunes built on speculation and evaporated just as quickly. We look back at William Hartford and his glass palace and think, how foolish. How wasteful. How blind to the unsustainability of it all. But we are building our own conservatories. Different materials. Different purposes. Same fundamental flaw. The assumption that wealth and will can sustain anything. That if we can afford to build it, we can afford to maintain it. That the costs are only financial and those costs don't matter if you're rich enough. That environmental impact, human cost, and long-term sustainability are problems for other people to worry about. William Hartford spent over $1 million in his lifetime maintaining tropical plants in Connecticut. In today's currency, adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $40 million. For what? Beauty, he would have said. Achievement. Wonder. The ability to command nature itself. To prove that human ingenuity and determination could overcome any obstacle. But in the end, the conservatory commanded him. It consumed his fortune. It survived just long enough to prove it could not survive. It demonstrated that some things, no matter how beautiful, no matter how desired, simply cannot be sustained against the basic facts of economics and ecology and human limitation. And when it died, it left nothing behind but a foundation slowly being reclaimed by the very nature Hartford had tried to control. The last person to see the Hartford Conservatory in its glory days was a gardener named Michael Torres. He was interviewed in 2010 at age 83 by a local historian working on an oral history project. Torres had worked at the estate as a boy in the mid-1920s, doing odd jobs, helping with outdoor gardens. He remembered the conservatory in its final years before demolition. Empty and decaying. Glass panels missing. Weeds growing inside. But his grandfather had worked there in the early days. Had known Ambrose Thorne. Had been one of the original 12 gardeners hired in 1895. Torres remembered the stories his grandfather told. How beautiful it was. Like walking into another world. Like stepping through a door and finding yourself in a jungle, even though snow was falling outside. The warmth. The humidity. The smell of flowers that didn't grow anywhere else in Connecticut. And how hard the work was. Brutal. Endless. His grandfather had lasted 3 years. Left with respiratory problems that plagued him the rest of his life. Died at 52, his lungs scarred from years of breathing humid air filled with mold spores and plant particles. The historian asked, was it worth it? Torres thought for a long time before answering. I remember my grandfather showing me a photograph once. The conservatory in 1902, I think. Glass shining in the sun. Everything perfect. He pointed to the building and said, that was the most beautiful thing I ever saw in my life. Torres paused. Then he pointed to the men standing in front of the conservatory in the photo. 12 of them. The original gardening crew. And he said, and that's what it cost. He tapped the photograph with his finger. We all have a number in that photo. Some of us lived long lives. Some didn't. Some left after a few years. Some stayed longer than they should have. But we all paid the price for another man's dream. The historian asked, are you bitter? Torres shook his head slowly. No. Bitter doesn't change anything. Bitter doesn't bring back the men who died or fix the men who were damaged. Mr. Hartford thought he was building paradise. My grandfather and the others, they knew they were building something else. A monument to wealth. A display of power. Something that could never last. He looked out the window of his small house. They were both right, in their way. It was beautiful. And it was unsustainable. And maybe that's the lesson. That some beautiful things can't last. Shouldn't last. Because they cost too much in ways we don't want to count. The photograph Torres mentioned is now in the Connecticut Historical Society archives. 17 men standing in front of the conservatory in 1902. Ambrose Thorne in the center. Robert Sullivan to his left, 6 months before he died. 3 of those men would be dead within 5 years. Only 6 would survive to age 70. Their names are recorded in Ambrose Thorne's ledger. Their stories mostly lost to time. But they built something magnificent. And paid for it with their health, their time, and in some cases, their lives. So when we stand before our own monuments to excess, when we marvel at yachts and towers and private spacecraft, we might ask ourselves the same question Torres's grandfather asked. What is this costing? Not in dollars, which are easy to count. But in the hidden prices we agree not to notice. The environmental damage. The labor exploitation. The resources consumed that can never be recovered. The sustainability problems we're creating for future generations. And we might remember the glass palaces. All 200 of them. How magnificent they were. How briefly they lasted. How completely they failed. Because extravagance without sustainability is just another form of ruin. And glass palaces, no matter how beautiful, no matter how expensive, no matter how desired, cannot stand forever against the basic truths of economics and ecology and human limitation. The conservatory is gone. The fortune that built it is gone. The man who dreamed it is gone. But the lesson remains. Paradise has always come with a price. The Hartford Conservatory's price was measured in deaths and dollars, in broken bodies and bankrupted fortunes, in plants that should never have been torn from their native soil and men who should never have been asked to maintain them. And that price, sooner or later, always comes due. The Glass Palace rose in 1895. It died in 1917. It was demolished in 1933. And now, nearly a century later, most people don't even know it existed. But in the cracks of its foundation, native orchids grow. And the forest slowly reclaims the hillside. And nature, patient and persistent, proves what William Hartford never accepted. That some things cannot be commanded. That winter will always come. That glass and iron and human will cannot hold back the world forever. And that perhaps the most beautiful things are not the ones we build against nature, but the ones we allow to exist within it.